I am Cassie, and this is Lauren. And tonight we are going to be talking about some of our favorite saints. The reason that we felt like this was a good topic for Fidelis is because the reason we created this site and this organization is because we found that in the Catholic blogosphere and Facebook groups, there tends to be a lot of emphasis on the right kind of Catholic woman. Where you're always supposed to be sweet and you don't argue and you're never passionate about anything, and you can't wear pants. You have to get married and have all the babies as soon as you can, and then once you have the babies, you have to stay home and take care of them because you can't go work outside of the home. And that seems to be very prevalent. And we personally found it frustrating, but it was also something that a lot of other Catholic women we know found frustrating, because there isn't a right way to be a Catholic woman. There isn't a one-size-fits-all model. And there's no better way to show that than by looking to the saints. If you look at the saints, both male and female, really, there's so much variety with the different personalities, the different vocations, and the different lives that were led. And it really shows that no matter who you are and what your calling is and what kind of life you're leading, there's a saint there that you can look to for inspiration and for guidance. And so that's what we wanted to discuss tonight. And the first person that really seems best to talk about is none other than Mary herself, because she really is the premier, female saint. So, Lauren, what are your thoughts on Mary? Have you felt, close to her at certain points in your life? What does she mean to you?
Mary's always been one that I felt like was harder for me to get to know. And that might sound weird because I feel like most people that I know like really bond with Mary easily, and then like maybe not necessarily as much with other saints. So something that helped and didn't totally solve all the like struggle that I have with connecting with Mary, but something that really helped was reading Louis de Montfort's True Devotion to Mary, I think it's called, and doing the consecration to Mary according to his formula. And that was interesting because he kind of goes through how Mary is an advocate for us to God. And I think that helped me to understand her role better. And I'm still working on it, but I feel like trying to pray the rosary often helps me just to like get to know her a little better, little by little, but it's always something I'm working on. But obviously she's the example par excellence. And I really like the way that St. Louis de Montfort describes her as like, he says that when you tell Mary something, she'll whisper it in Jesus's ear for you. And I love that image of Mary.
For me, I didn't really feel particularly close to her until I became a mother myself. And then that kind of changed everything. Because before, when I was younger, you always hear about Mary as, oh, she's born without sin. And there's this, that was the image that kind of stuck in my mind, that she was this perfect person who, you see the paintings and sculptures and everything of her, and she looks kind of, I don't know, almost aloof. Mm-hmm. And it was just hard to connect with that because I am not a sinless person by any stretch of the imagination. And so it's hard to identify with that. But then I had children, and suddenly things like the 7 Stars of Mary, now that hits me like just deep in my heart. And, things like watching the Passion of the Christ as an example, and when Jesus falls, and Mary has this flashback to him falling as a child. And it makes me emotional just thinking about it, because she may have been a person without sin, but she was a mother, and she had a mother's love. It wasn't just that this was, Jesus, the Son of God. This was her son, and being able to connect with that, and then carrying a child, she was a Theotokos. She, was the God bearer. Obviously, that's not me. But again, it was something that I could relate to with her, feeling that I've carried life. I've loved a child the way that she loved a child. And so now, still pray the rosary and everything, but at the same time, there will be times my kids are driving me crazy and I'm just like, Mary, I really need you to help me out right now because I cannot take another minute.
Yeah. Yeah.
So connecting with her as a mother has really helped me a lot in growing closer to her.
I love that. And I love what you said about it being hard to relate to her as someone who is sinless and the mother of God. And I think it's hard to get past that conception of Mary, because at the end of the day, like, how she lived out her own personal holiness was in large part the way that she embraced the sufferings that came her way and like overcame them. And she like faced the greatest suffering of seeing her own son suffer and die in front of her. And I think it's so true that when you become a mom, that hits home so strongly. That's a really good point.
And it also kind of helped me knowing my own feelings as a mother. Now, the idea of, the Memorare or other prayers to her where it's, well, Mary never leaves any prayer unaided. It's easier for me to understand that now because I know that as a mother, when one of my children comes to me, it may not be the answer that they want, but I'm never going to leave them hanging. I'm always going to care for my children. I'm always going to love them. And that's what Mary is for us. And it's kind of funny because it took me becoming a mother for that to click, to understand that. And so now, I feel a lot closer to her than I ever have before in my life because I'm a mother myself.
Right. I love that.
So which saints do you feel that you are particularly close to or admire? Do you have one that you want to discuss?
Yes. Well, I have a whole list. Yeah. I really love reading saint biographies, and I love that the church gives us saints. And I think the church times like who she canonizes when as a way of telling us like, this is the example that the world needs right now. And so there's a lot of modern saints, especially modern women saints that I really, not relate to so much. Maybe I would say have learned so much from their example by reading about them. Saint Therese and her mom, Zélie Martin. Saint Maria Goretti is a pretty modern saint. Then, of course, Saint Gianna, who I know we both love very much. Saint Chiara Corbella, who just actually died in, I think, 2008. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure. So it's so cool to think that there are people that came really shortly before we did who were able to live in the modern world and somehow become saints in the midst of it. And so I love that. So, but maybe we can start with someone who's a little further back, like Saint Joan of Arc, who I know is a big one for both of us.
Yes. Well, everyone loves Joan of Arc.
Yeah. Yeah, she's one of those like household Catholic names, isn't she?
Yeah.
I love St. Joan of Arc because when I was growing up as a teenager, especially, I definitely embraced the whole soldier of Christ like identity, which is good when you're a teenager because you do have to deal with so much in the modern world. But I read Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, not St. Mark Twain, as far as I know. That book is so interesting because he spent a long time researching Joan of Arc's life. I think he spent a long time in France, just reading like original source documents and reading her trial. And he actually uses dialogue from her trial that's historically recorded in the book. So the book is historical fiction, but as much direct quote that he could get, he did incorporate it into the book. And so it's such an interesting way to read a saint's biography, to know that at least the trial section of the book, these are things she was actually saying. And she was such a badass. Like she was facing, this is a young woman who goes from being like practically a shepherdess in rural France as a teenager to being called by God.
Right?
What's that?
She couldn't even read, right? Right? Wasn't she?
As far as I know, I think she was illiterate.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think her job at home was to like spin wool to get it ready to make clothes. Very simple young woman. She says that saints appeared to her and told her that she was called to go and confront the Dauphin, the heir to the throne, or the illegitimate heir to the throne of France. Basically kind of like try to correct a civil conflict that was going on between France and Burgundy. And then she ultimately ends up being captured by enemies and put on trial. And the way that this young woman interacts with these older, very well-educated, very cunning men in this trial, it just blows you away when you read it, because there's no explanation for how intelligent her responses are, other than the fact that the Holy Spirit really was inspiring what she was saying to these people. And the way that she was able to answer we would say today, all the haters, from like people in her own town who doubted her mission to the people that she had to deal with on trial, was just so confident. She basically just told them, well, God told me to do this, so I'm here doing it. What's the problem? And she didn't really take any of their hate personally or internalize it, I don't think, because she ended up getting burned at the stake. And she told some people that were there at her burning to witness it, to go and get her a crucifix and hold it up and hold it in front of her eyes until she died. And I think she was so conscious that keeping the fact that God did that before she did, and having that as an example to follow, is what she was able to hold on to as she went through that horrific experience. And so I just love her. She's been a big influence in my life, and somebody that I've been able to turn to when I feel like that boldness is needed. What about you?
Well, I remember as far as the whole, her being a badass, you can just look at her behavior on the battlefield, because I want to say she was scaling a wall, and she had a cannonball dropped on her head. She was shot with an arrow, and she kept going. Like, it didn't slow her down. She just, nothing stopped her. And one of the things in the trial transcript that stood out to me, and I'm probably going to butcher this quote, but, they asked her if she was in God's grace. And it was meant to be a gotcha question, because if you say you're not, well, then that's proof that you're guilty. If you say that you are, well, that's heresy, because no one can do that. And she was able to understand what they were trying to do, and said something along the lines of, if I am in God's grace, then let him keep me there. Something like that.
Yep.
And it struck me, because that's so very Christ-like. And I don't mean in the sense that, she was being a good Christian. I mean, literally, that's the type of thing that Jesus had to do all the time when the Pharisees are sitting there trying to catch him in these gotcha questions. And he would have, these perfect responses. And that's exactly what Joan of Arc did. Mm-hmm. So that really stood out to me. But at the same time, her story is just so, it's incredible. But at the same time, this is probably the mother part of me again, but just, she was a young girl, and what she went through once she was captured. I mean, she was not just harassed, but violated, and just tortured, and all of the things that she went through, and then she died in this horrific, terrible way. It's tragic and awful, but at the same time, she never wavered. She never lost her faith in the sight of that. And that's really something to emulate, and for me, because how do you know that your faith is that strong, that when you're going through such horrible trial, that you're not going to waver, that you're going to stand strong and you'll never back down? Joan of Arc did that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so good to know that there are other people that have done this. So if you're ever called to that, into a situation like that, okay, I can recall all these people that have done this before me. And so there's an example, and I just love her. She's the best. We're going to post some quotes from St. Joan of Arc in the comment section after the video. For anyone who hasn't read her trial, I highly recommend it. Not only is it enlightening, it's just extremely entertaining and mind-boggling to think, how did this young girl do this? Actually, there's a parallel I kind of wanted to draw between St. Joan of Arc and Our Lady. And I think we think of Saint Joan of Arc as this like warrior woman, which like if you read her life, you kind of realize that she was a meek young woman, but she is depicted as a soldier. And then on the other hand, Our Lady is depicted as this like meek young girl who is in her cardboard holy pose all the time. But I think we have to realize that there was overlap between like Saint Joan of Arc's stereotype and Our Lady's. Saint Joan of Arc was also came from like a meek background and was called at a really young age, just like Our Lady. And then on the flip side, Our Lady was the most heroic, stalwart, strong woman that has ever walked the face of the earth. And I think that just gets overlooked in all of the talk that we rightly have about her gentleness and humility. We also have to remember, like, this woman overcame the hardest thing that anyone can have to overcome. And so we got to give her credit for that. So I like that kind of parallel between Saint Joan of Arc and Our Lady.
Well, and another saint that I particularly like a lot, and actually my daughter is named for her, is another martyr, and that is Saint Felicity. My daughter Felicity is named for Saint Felicity. And one of the reasons that I think that they kind of are similar is that both of them, I mean, obviously were martyrs, but they both underwent these trials and never backed down on their faith. You know, Joan didn't, and neither did Felicity. And in case anyone is not familiar with the story of Perpetua and Felicity, Perpetua was this wealthy noblewoman, and she converted to Christianity. These were Perpetua and Felicity were two of the very early Christian martyrs. We're talking the first several hundred years of the church, when persecution was, you know, rampant. Perpetua's father wanted her to abandon and renounce her faith. She refused, and Felicity was one of her servants. And Felicity likewise had converted to Christianity and likewise refused to renounce her faith. And Felicity was pregnant at the time, which, you know, makes it even more just awful. They were made to be killed in the Roman amphitheaters and the Colosseums. And just before they were to be martyred, Felicity gave birth to her baby girl. I don't know what happened to her daughter. I hope that, you know, her daughter ended up living a long life. But Perpetua and Felicity ended up being beheaded. And it's a tragic, awful story. But what stands out to me is the depth of their faith. And the reason that it's so extraordinary when you look at Felicity and any of the early martyrs, they don't have what we have to go on as far as to strengthen their faith. We have centuries of church teachings and doctrine. We have the Bible. We have all of these, you know, encyclicals from popes, and I mean, just all of this to bolster our faith. We even have science now. There's even, you know, like the miracle at Lanciano to prove that Jesus is physically present in the Eucharist. We have all of these things to bolster our faith. Someone who was martyred in the first 100 years of the church, they didn't have that. They had nothing. I mean, really, they had nothing. And yet they believed so strongly and so fully that they were willing to give their lives. That is just, to me, that's incredible. I can't even imagine having, I mean, just nothing to go on and knowing that you were right anyways and being willing to die for it.
Yeah. It's convicting to us now, having so much and having it at our fingertips. I mean, we can Google anything about our faith. And we have churches in the U.S. all over the place. You know, it's not like we have to walk 3 hours on Sunday to get to Mass or anything crazy. And I think we've taken it for granted, like in general. I know I have. So those are great examples to look back on and say, if these people were willing to get eaten by a lion, literally, because they believed in God based on very little that they had, we can do a little better.
Yes, for sure. And I think they're also good examples to look at, you know, for me, Saint Felicity, if I'm starting to waver or if I'm starting to feel like it's too much, or, things are particularly hard at the moment, Felicity for me is a good example to look to, because, again, she had so little to go on. Her faith didn't waver, right up to the point that she died for it. So that for me is especially inspiring.
Amen.
So
another one of the more ancient saints that I know you like is Saint Cecilia. And I actually don't know very much about her. Can you give us a little overview?
Yeah, Saint Cecilia, she's the patron saint of music and singers. And originally that was, why I really liked her, because I sang a lot when I was younger. I took professional voice lessons in high school, and really, really loved Saint Cecilia. My voice teacher actually was the person who introduced me to her. So first it was just because I was a singer and Cecilia was a singer. But her story is actually incredible. She was a Roman noblewoman, and she was said to be just this beautiful, beautiful woman and had lots of admirers. And she was a Christian. This was, again, during the time of Roman persecution. And her family did not support her Christian faith, and they forced her to be married to a pagan. And she originally had, refused and didn't want to do it, and because they weren't Christians. And when they came, her husband and his brother came to, forcibly take her and force her into the marriage, if I'm remembering correctly. She warned them not to harm her or to do anything to her, because her guardian angel would protect her. And they actually physically saw the angel there standing beside her. And so at that sight, they, just fell down in fear, and then they converted as well. So she was able to successfully convert her husband and his brother. And so then her husband and his brother not only became Christians, but they were then going and evangelizing to other people and were converting other pagans to Christianity. And they eventually got caught. So they were killed, and you were not allowed to bury the Christians at that time. They were not allowed to be given, Christian burial. So Cecilia, being the devoted wife and badass that she is, was not having that. And so she went and she got her husband and his brother, and she buried them. And it was at this point that she was caught. And so at that point, she was given the option of renouncing or dying. And of course she chose to die. And the problem was that it was very difficult for them to kill her. The executioner came, and first they tried to behead her, and they struck her on the neck with the sword 3 times, and she didn't die. So then they trapped her in a steam room where she would suffocate. And 3 days later, they came back, and she had still not died. So eventually, when she did die, the legend has it she was found with her fingers outstretched, 3 for the Trinity. And her body is said to be one of the incorruptible saints. And so that is the story of Saint Cecilia, who is pretty amazing, I think.
Okay, can we just take a minute to debunk the myth that the Catholic Church tries to repress women? Because I don't think the church would go around canonizing people that stood up to men as their calling if the church didn't think that was pretty badass.
I know, right?
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of really great, strong women who are, not just members of the church, but saints. Right. And Saint Cecilia is a great example of it. And it's one of the things that I like about her story now, too, is that she not only had this great love for the Lord, but she had this great love for her family and her husband, too. And her love for them helps them to be converted to Christianity. And then she shows them this last respect by, burying their bodies. And her story is amazing.
That's incredible. I'm going to need to buy a book about her now. So maybe we can pull up to a little bit more modern times now. I'm trying to see chronologically. When was Jane Frances de Chantal around?
She is another one of my favorites. I'm not exactly sure exactly when. Oh, she was in the 1500s. Okay. So,
Okay.
yeah. She is a saint who she was born in France, and she was said to be a very beautiful woman, and she was married to a man, and they had children. They had children, and she loved her husband. She and her husband had this beautiful, amazing marriage, and actually, there's a quote from her to her husband that I really, really love, and I'm going to try to find that right now. But yeah, she was married, and they had children together. And the quote is, oh wait, oh, that was Saint Gianna. Never mind. We'll get to her in a minute. There is a quote from Saint Jane that I'm going to mention though. There is one, but the one I was thinking of was Saint Gianna. But anyways, Saint Jane was married, and they had 4 children, and they were only married for about 7 years, and then her husband was killed in this tragic hunting accident. And when he was, she was just completely heartbroken. And her husband, likewise, being a good Christian, the man that shot him, told him that he forgave him, and told him, don't commit the sin of hating yourself when you have done nothing wrong. But Jane herself was so heartbroken that she had trouble forgiving him, and she struggled with it for a long time. And so she kind of took it in baby steps. And at first she just settled with, okay, well, I'm going to greet him on the street. I'm going to say hello to him when he passes.
Wow.
And then after that, she, when she was able to do that, she then invited him into her house. And then eventually their relationship became so close that she became the godmother to his child. Anyways, she was very devout in her Christian faith, and her bishop was St. Francis de Sales, and they were very close friends, and they wrote letters, and she founded her own order for women, and that was what she did. And she died in 1641. And I kind of one of the things that I like about her is that, one, she had this deep, amazing love for her husband, and she was a wife and a mother. So often, at least for me, when I think of saints, I usually tend to think of them as, as nuns or single women, or, young women, or who were martyred. And Saint Jane was a wife and a mother, and she loved her husband. And then the other thing, that this is where the quote comes into play, that she failed. Not failed, but she struggled. She wasn't perfect. She sinned and had to keep going. And she was able to give a great amount of inspiration, at least for me, because of that. And her quote that I really love is, "Should you fall even 50 times a day, never on any account should that surprise or worry you. Instead, ever so gently set your heart back in the right direction and practice the opposite virtue, all the time speaking words of love and trust to our Lord after you have committed 1,000 faults, as much as if you had committed only one. Once we have humbled ourselves for the faults God allows us to become aware of in ourselves, we must forget them and go forward." And that really speaks to me, because I mess up all the time. So it's kind of nice to hear a saint that, can kind of acknowledge the same thing and say, hey, it's okay. You fall, just get back up and keep going. It's all right. And actually, you kind of see that attitude in Pope Francis right now, too. So,
it's so interesting to me that there's saints who give you good advice, not just for your spiritual life, but also for your psychological health, because being able to move on after you've stumbled is so good for you. And another thing that you mentioned that she did was forgave. She was able to take incremental steps toward forgiving the person who had essentially robbed her of the most important thing in her life. And so I'm sure that was a huge milestone for her to achieve, but the way that she was able to break it up into steps, that's amazing. It feels like a psychiatrist must have told her that or something, because that's brilliant.
Yeah, it's something that's it's like achievable.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. In a maybe less relatable form of forgiveness, we have Saint Maria Goretti, who had this extraordinarily heroic act of forgiveness, and the forgiveness that she gave her perpetrator that we'll talk about is ultimately why she was probably canonized, and as far as I understand, and B, probably what caused her abuser to convert himself. And so let's talk a little bit about her next.
Yeah, Saint Maria Goretti is actually my patron saint. I did not appreciate her as much when I was younger, and part of the reason for that is because there tends to be this emphasis on the fact that she's a rape victim and a murder victim, and she fought to preserve her chastity and died to preserve her chastity. And this is, true, sort of. But that's not why she's a saint, and that's not why she's revered, and it's not why she should be revered. I feel like we do a disservice when that's what we focus on. And that was why it was so hard for me to really understand her and feel close to her for a long, long time. And then now, becoming an adult, looking more at her story, it's become more clear to me that what's truly incredible about her is her ability to give mercy and forgiveness to her attacker, who is Alessandro Serenelli. And even aside from that, just her selflessness. She wasn't, during her rape and murder, there is this, people say, oh, well, she was fighting to preserve her chastity. During her attack, though, she wasn't begging him to stop because she wanted to remain a virgin. She was begging him to stop because she was scared for his soul, Right. That's the kind of person that Maria Goretti was. She was telling him that it would damn him to hell. She was scared for his soul. What kind of person, what incredible person must you be that someone is attacking you, raping you, stabbing you 14 times, and you're thinking of their well-being. You're thinking of them. And
she's incredible.
And so and then on top of that, she, forgives him. And when she's in the hospital, the doctor was, basically told her that, she was going to die, and she told him that she would, pray for him when she was in heaven. And then before she died, literally in the moments before she died, she said to her mother that she forgave Alessandro and that she wanted him to be in heaven with her.
Yeah.
That is what people should be focusing on when they think about Maria Goretti. That is what they should focus on, because that's what she is. She's not the, the virgin saint. She's called the little saint of great mercy, because that's what she is. And that's something that truly should be emulated. And it's hard for me. We've said in a previous, discussion, forgiveness is not my easy, does not come easily to me. Mm-hmm. I hold grudges. My husband teases me about it all the time. Hi, thank you. But she was able to forgive, right away, just no issues at all. And that's what's truly incredible about her. And she was so young. She was just a child. I mean, she was 11 years old, years old. Mm-hmm. And she had that kind of just wisdom and depth of mercy. And her relics were actually taken on a tour around the United States, and they came to Jacksonville, where I live, and I was able to go and see them. And it was just this incredibly moving experience for me. I mean, not just because she's my patron saint, obviously that as well, but just sitting there and seeing her tiny little casket, tiny little casket, and her tiny little body. And it's heart-wrenching. It really was heart-wrenching to see. But it was also, I think, a huge step in me feeling closer to her as my patron saint.
She's amazing. I remember growing up hearing her story and having a similar interpretation that she was the saint who died defending her chastity. And the moral of the story was that sexual purity is the most important thing. And really the moral of her story, like you said, is mercy and forgiveness. I believe her, Alessandro, her abuser, testified later so the interesting thing about this is she died so young that her mother and her abuser and other family members were able to see her canonization process through.
Yes.
And so I think she came to, she appeared to Alessandro in dreams or visions while he was in prison. And he spent like many decades in prison, I believe, for his crime of killing Maria Goretti. But she came to him and told him that she forgave him. And it was like she was relentlessly forgiving him, even more than he was relentlessly asking for forgiveness. So much so was she forgiving him that he, I think, realized the depth of what he had done and became repentant for it. And he himself had a conversion of heart. And then ultimately he worked with Maria Goretti's mom to work through the canonization. Can you imagine, as a mother, like working with the person who murdered your child to canonize? It's mind-boggling. I mean, I think Maria Goretti didn't just leave a powerful story behind. Like, she left a legacy of people's lives that were impacted in real time right after she died and in those decades following. And I think she was ultimately canonized by Pope John Paul the Great, my favorite pope, if you're allowed to say that. And it's just such a cool story because her murderer and her mother were at her canonization together. I mean, it's just mind-blowing.
Yeah, when he was released from prison, he went to her mother and begged her to forgive him. And she said, well, you know, if Maria could forgive you on her deathbed, so can I. And they went to Mass together the very next day. And after that, I believe they had a fairly close relationship from then on. And Alessandro is said to have prayed to her every single day and referred to her as my little saint. And yes, in 1950, when Maria Goretti was canonized, he was there. And he didn't just convert, but he became a lay brother of the order, I'm looking right now, Order of Friars Minor Capuchin. And he lived in the monastery and worked as its gardener until he died.
So he was a member of St. Francis's order, which St. Francis and St. Clare founded Franciscans and Poor Clares together. So that's awesome. And one thing that always strikes me about the story too is that it must be from Alessandro that we get the story of Maria's heroism, because they were the only two people there. And so probably wouldn't have the record. I'm sure that she relayed things, and I know that people found them, but I think there were portions of what happened that only he was privy to after her death that would have gone into her canonization process. And that's, I can't think of any other examples. They may exist, but I just always can't get past the fact that her murderer is the person who really made her canonization happen.
Yeah. Now, I know that one of your favorite saints is Saint Therese.
Yes. Saint Therese was like my first favorite saint, I guess you would say. She's the one that I've been like close to my whole life. And I know we talked about, when we talked about my vocation story, how I used to be a nun, that the thing that initially drew me to religious life was that my mom read me the story of Saint Therese. It was like a children's biography of Saint Therese's life. And she just had, in some ways, her life was really unremarkable. And I think that is why so many people have been able to resonate with her, because what Saint Therese is known for is her little way of embracing every small thing, every small annoyance, every trial, every inconvenience that comes your way, and control, and realizing that holiness is in how we react to those things every single day. It's not necessarily in a Joan of Arc moment where you get burned at the stake, or where you die in childbirth because you wouldn't receive treatment, in a heroic way, wouldn't receive treatment for something that occurred during your pregnancy. For Saint Therese, she, first of all, she went through a lot growing up, and the way that she handled those trials, I think, impacted the strength of her character later in life. But she died at the age of 24. and had already, achieved holiness at that age. And her secret was every little thing in her life that was in some way not enjoyable to her, she would turn it around and love the person that was doing it. And it was in all those millions of small things that she found her way to heaven. And that's the message to us. And I think the reason that she's such a seminal figure in the church since her life in the 1800s is that she kind of provided a paradigm for how do the rest of us become holy, those of us that aren't going to be burned at the stake or be able to give up our lives for somebody else. And the blueprint is the little way. And we've seen that echoed by so many figures. I mean, it's kind of the premise of the whole Opus Dei movement founded by St. Josemaria Escriva, that holiness is in your daily life. It was a huge piece of what St. John Paul the Great preached. And it's been something that's been echoed by so many saints. But I think the church really knew what she was doing when she gave us St. Therese as a model for living that holiness in our daily life, no matter what vocation we're in. And so she just had a profound impact on my life. My husband and I were actually married on her feast day in 2011. We got engaged like more than 2 years before we got married. I was a freshman in college. And so we kind of like pulled out my cell phone and we were just looking at the calendar and like trying to pick a year and a month that we would get married, knowing that it should probably be like closer to when I was going to graduate in case I got pregnant right away. And it would be hard to like raise a baby and try to finish college at the same time. So we were looking like, okay, let's look a couple years out and see what there is. And we just kind of we realized that October 1st, 2011 was a Saturday that was convenient. And so we like picked that as our date 2 years ahead of time. And so she had a great impact on me as a kid and growing up. And then we kind of like were able to carry her into our marriage. And she's just been one of those, like, I feel like she's my friend, but I've never met her in real life, so it's kind of fun.
Well, I never felt particularly close to St. Therese, probably because I don't know enough about her. And I actually have on hold right now her book, her autobiography. So I'm looking forward to reading that soon. I'm really excited to read that. I do identify a lot more with her mother, who is now a saint on her own, and that is Saint Zélie. And actually, she and her husband, Louis and Zélie Martin, were the first married couple to be canonized together, which is amazing. Yeah. And they were canonized together, and they were the parents of 5 nuns and a saint. That is like marriage goals.
Yeah,
right there. To become not only a saint yourself, but then for your children to become saints also. I mean, that's just incredible. And Zélie is one of the things that, is interesting about her is that she was a lace maker. Her husband made watches and she made lace. And Zélie was the one that was more successful. And we're talking about someone who lived in the 1800s. That's relatively recently, but in the 1800s, you didn't have a whole lot of women working. Mm-hmm. That really wasn't done. But she was not only a lace maker, but she was the successful one. And Louis gave up his business as a watchmaker in order to go and join her in her business because she was so successful. So that I always thought was pretty cool, especially being that, I'm a working mother as well. And there, like I said at the beginning, there tends to be, this idea that kind of runs rampant, especially a lot of Facebook groups for Catholic women that, you're supposed to stay home with your kids and never work. And it's like, well, I know some saints who would disagree.
That's exactly why they're canonized, is because the church disagrees and they want to make that clear.
Yeah. But one of the things about Saint Zélie that I appreciate is that she's got her own writings that you can read her letters and her diaries and everything. And Saint Therese specifically, she talks about how she was a handful, how she was kind of a brat when she was a toddler. So parents everywhere, if your kids drive you crazy and they're little hellions and scream all the time and are never good, Don't worry, Saint Therese was the same way. So there's hope for you yet.
Yes. Your child might be the next doctor of the church. You never know.
I tell myself that all the time.
Yeah. I love that she was canonized with her husband because, like I said, the church always canonizes who they know the church, the people of the church need as an example in that time. So these two were canonized in 2015, and I think that sent a pretty clear message to people that what we need is faithful marriages, strong parents, strong families. I think the message that was being sent by Pope Francis was pretty clear when he said, oh, well, this family already has a daughter saint, but let's go ahead and also canonize her parents. What message is that sending? What was their life story, and how is it applicable to our life today? And obviously, family is disintegrating in our culture. And so I just thought it was so beautiful to see that message from the church that they were affirming family is really important and strong marriages are really important.
And another one of their children, I'm looking right now, I didn't even know this, but another one of their children is now a candidate for sainthood.
Wow.
I mean, that's just amazing. It's amazing. And so, yeah, she's definitely someone that I pray to when I'm getting frustrated. I'm like, okay, I really, really, really need you to help me out here. Because you had your share of, troublesome children who became saints. So please show me the way, because I'm going crazy.
Yeah. Saint Therese was only like 4. Saint Therese was the youngest of the 5, and she was only 4 when Zélie died. So Zélie did something, she was doing something right during those years, that she was bringing up Therese, even as a working mom, which I know a lot of people would argue was probably detrimental to Therese. I think the church has come back and made it pretty clear that whatever she was doing, it was working.
And one of the things that she gets criticized for, that I think may be the most ludicrous thing I have ever heard in my entire life. I have literally seen this multiple times. Mm-hmm. She's been criticized for not breastfeeding her children.
Oh, wow. I knew she didn't breastfeed, but I didn't know people criticized her for it. That's crazy. Mommy wars try to extend into history.
Yes. It's like 1800s version of mommy wars. Like, what is going on?
Jeez.
Yeah. But it just again is another example that no matter who you are and what your situation is, there is a saint for you. There is a saint for you.
Yes. There is no mold that you have to fit yourself into. And I think that's why Saint Therese is such a good example, because Saint Therese basically said, it doesn't matter who you are, what your situation is. The way to sainthood isn't by fitting a mold. It's by taking everything that comes at you and controlling your reaction to it and making it love.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I'm looking forward to reading her book. And when I went and put it on hold like 2 weeks ago at the library, and I considered it a very good sign. There is a waiting list for it. I was shocked because there haven't been. I requested Bishop Barron's new book and Pope Francis, The Name of God is Mercy, and both of those got them right away. Saint Therese, her autobiography, has a waiting list. So I thought that's pretty amazing. She's awesome. A lot of people.
That's good. I'll give you a little disclaimer about the book. So the way it reads, it is like very flowery and like soft. I don't know the way to describe it, but the language almost drove me crazy at one point, one of the times that I was reading it. And I had to keep reminding myself that this was the actual way that you wrote. Everyone across the board wrote in these days. And so if anyone's like me and people not getting straight to the point or overly embellishing things bothers you, I cannot read Charles Dickens. He takes way too long to explain what's going on. I have reading pet peeves. So that the way that Saint Therese writes, it's not really a reflection of her personality necessarily. It's just the way that people wrote in France in the 1800s. Just throwing that out there.
Well, and I think we can close with 2 more people, one of which is not a saint yet. She is being considered for sainthood. But they are both 2 very modern women. And the next one that I want to talk about is Saint Gianna. And one of my other daughters is actually named for her, Clara Gianna. And she was a very, very modern saint. I think she's one of your favorite saints, too.
Yeah, she is. Big time. Mm-hmm.
So for anyone who is not familiar with Saint Gianna, she died in 1962. So she's literally very, very modern. And she was married, and that was the quote that, I had thought of before, Saint Jane, because like Jane, she very much loved her husband. And what this quote is that she said about her husband, "I have found you, and I intend to give myself totally in order to form a truly Christian family," which I think is just so beautiful, because that's the goal, to give yourself totally to your spouse and to build this Christian family together. And so that's what she did. And she was pregnant with her fourth child, and things did not go well with the pregnancy. But before that, she was a pediatrician. I should have mentioned that before. She was a pediatrician. So St. Gianna in the 60s, she was a doctor, which is pretty incredible because I'm pretty sure you didn't have a whole lot of female doctors at the time. So St. Gianna was a doctor, and she's pregnant with her fourth child, and she developed a fibroma on her uterus. And the doctors told her that she basically had three options. She could have an abortion, she could have a complete hysterectomy, or they could remove the fibroma alone, which would be the most dangerous for her herself. And she refused to have the abortion with a hysterectomy because it would kill her child. And one of the things that should be pointed out here is that while the Catholic Church forbids abortion, the hysterectomy would have been licit by church teachings, because the principle of double effect would have said, okay, well, we're removing your uterus to save your life. Your child will die, but that's an unintended consequence. You're not specifically killing your child.
Right.
But she still chose not to do that, even though she could, because she wanted to save her child's life. And so she delivered her daughter, who is also named Gianna, and via C-section. And then 1 week after having her, after having severe pain that entire week, she became septic and she died. And her daughter, Gianna, that she gave her life for, is now a doctor herself. And God, it makes me emotional just talking about it. Is a doctor herself now, and she tours and talks about her mother and her legacy. And so that is Saint Gianna, and that's her story. And her husband would say that Gianna made the choice to give up her life she didn't purposely say, okay, I want to die. She wanted to live.
And she knew what was going on because she was a doctor.
Right. Right. And that's what her husband said, is that, she made this choice to risk her own life to save her daughter Gianna's, both as a mother and as a doctor, which makes it really even more powerful to me.
Love it. Yeah, and whenever I always come back to why did the church canonize this person at this time? Because there's always like all these people that are up for canonization, and that there's so many people in heaven, I'm assuming, that are not officially canonized. Why did the church choose this person? And three things always stand out to me with her. First, she was a wife and mom, so they're affirming the importance of that role, that seemingly unimportant but actually extraordinarily important role of being a wife and a mom. Then she was a working woman. I believe her kids were with a nanny during the day because she was a pediatrician. And also there's that strong pro-life message in what she did. Like you mentioned, the principle of double effect, she would have been morally licit to have the hysterectomy, but she made this heroic decision for her daughter's life. And so I think that canonizing her was kind of the church's way of affirming the importance of the pro-life values that we hold today when abortion is so widely accepted in the culture.
Yeah. And in her honor, actually, it's the Gianna Center in New York. And it is the first pro-life Catholic healthcare center for women in New York.
That's awesome.
And I mean, that's so much of what her legacy stands for, really, isn't it?
Yep.
And I can't imagine what she must have gone through that pregnancy. And I'm lying. I sort of can because I've had 5 C-sections, and my 5th pregnancy, you know, I was a little bit terrified the whole time because, you know, it's like, oh my, I was told at the end of my 4th pregnancy, you need to get a tubal ligation because another pregnancy will kill you. And that didn't happen. I didn't get the tubal ligation, obviously. But so yeah, that was definitely like in my mind. But yeah, she goes through this, you know, this trial where, you know, she's risking her life for her child. Mm-hmm. And I think that as a mother, I think that's something that, you know, you can really identify with, being a mother and knowing that you're willing to risk your life for your child because you love your child that much, even before they're born. Mm-hmm. Even before they're born, you love them that much. It's just really incredible.
And she's another one of those awesome saints whose husband was at her canonization. Mm-hmm. Which is a good seg into the last saint that we were going to talk about, which is, or she's not a saint yet.
Yeah, she's not a saint yet. I don't know as much about her, so I'm going to let you tell her story because I'm not as familiar.
I'm a little rusty, so bear with me. But the next person that we hope is canonized, and this is a good note to end on because I hope that we're all canonized one day, right? Chiara Corbella.
Yeah.
If she's canonized, it's possible that her husband will be at her canonization because Chiara Corbella just died in, I think, 2008. I'm going to post an article in the comments that I wrote for Live Action, but it was a while ago, so I have to brush up on her story, but it's just incredible. The first time I read this woman's story, I just automatically felt bonded with her, and not because I've had the same experiences, but just because how can you not feel close to another woman who was living the Catholic life in such modern times? Like, we weren't that far apart in age. She was 28 when she died. And so there's something about Chiara's story is really similar to Saint Therese's, and that's that she went through trials throughout her life, but none of them were things that seemed hugely heroic to overcome. So something interesting about her life that I did identify with is she struggled in her relationship with her husband when they were dating. It was like an on again, off again type of relationship. And she finally just kind of made the decision to commit to him, even though they went through things that were difficult for them and they didn't always get along. That's something that I think so many of us can identify with. So she made this commitment and they decided to get married. They had a strong marriage, but her husband doesn't hold back when he's talking about the things they went through. He's really candid, just saying, we had arguments all the time, and it's easy to relate to them in that way. So they became pregnant shortly after they got married. Their first pregnancy, I can't remember what the diagnosis it was, but they basically found out that the child was probably not going to live. And sure enough, she did carry the baby to term or almost to term, gave birth, and the child died, I believe, within hours of being born, died in her arms. So they accepted the loss and they consecrated the baby to God, and they went forward with this profound hope, just having confidence that God was going to take care of them going forward. And that this was their first child. They had no other children to kind of move forward with as a family. They lost the only one that they had. So she becomes pregnant again, and the baby, the second baby, is diagnosed with a fatal condition, but it's completely unrelated to what the first child had. So this couple doesn't have recessive genes that came together to produce an anomaly in their 2 pregnancies. Their 2 children just had these freak diagnoses that were completely unrelated to each other. So they have this 1 in a billion chance of having 2 sequential pregnancies carry to term with a fatal diagnosis. The next child is born, also dies in its parents' arms. What's incredible to me after the second child is born is that not only do they not despair, but they move forward still open to life. I think a lot of people would say, okay, this parenthood thing is not for us, or let's go the adoption route because I can't go through this again. And that would be understandable. But this couple somehow had this like supernatural trust that God was going to take care of them, and that even if their next child had a diagnosis, that they would still be able to get through it. And so they were again open to life. And in the third pregnancy, the baby was healthy. But Kiara herself received a diagnosis. I think she had a sore on her tongue, if I remember, and was diagnosed with cancer during the pregnancy. And I think she had whatever treatments were not invasive to the pregnancy. So she did make the decision to forego treatments that could have harmed the child. She could have morally had those treatments, but she did forego some treatments. I think she had a surgery on her mouth while she was pregnant. Again, I have to review the details, but ultimately that child is born healthy, and Kiara's health quickly deteriorates, and she dies very shortly after the third child, the first healthy child, is born. Kiara dies and leaves the child with the father. And yet, I think in all of this, Kiara's heroism stands out so much, and her just trust that no matter what happened, God was going to get them through it. But also, her husband is an incredible person to me, because he was with her through all of this, and then he ultimately lost her in the end as well. So I kind of view them as like a Lewis and Zelly couple, because I would not be surprised if this man is ultimately canonized. He's alive right now. He might see this at some point. Sorry if I'm mischaracterizing you, but I really admire you. And I really think that this is a couple that could be canonized together in the end as well. So I don't know what the exact status of her, they call it a cause for canonization or a cause for sainthood, is at the moment. I don't think she's even, there are like 4 steps to becoming a saint. There's like, you're a servant of God, then you're venerable, blessed, and then you're canonized. And canonized is like the official sainthood status that you receive. Everything else is kind of a step leading up to that. And there is a process that you have to go through where you have to, some miracles have to be attributed to you at each stage. And so I'm not sure if Kiara is even at servant of God yet, but I think she'll get there. And I think she's an incredible, incredible example to all of us. So read about her if you can. I think a book was recently written about her, and I'll post my live action article about her as well. But there are a few just articles about her life that are incredibly beautiful, and she's just someone I think that it's so easy to look to her as an example, because she was just alive literally like 9 years ago. So
yeah, we'll be posting links for all of the saints that we mentioned tonight too, so that you can read about them.
And please tell us yours. We want to know.
Yeah, we would love to hear, what saints are inspirational to you, especially if they're saints that aren't as well known. I really like to hear about saints that, I don't know as much about. So we would love to hear who you particularly look to. But I think that that's it for us tonight, and we're going to sign off for the evening. We hope you enjoyed this discussion, because these saints really, they really show what we're all about here at Fidelis, because all of them, you'll notice, are so different. Joan of Arc and Saint Therese could not be more different from each other. And then you have, Saint Gianna and Saint Maria Goretti, and they're also very different from each other. And it proves that as a Catholic woman, no matter who you are or where you are in your life, there's a saint for you, and there's a place for you. So we hope you enjoyed, learning some more about our favorite saints and this discussion. And we hope you'll see us next week here at Fidelis, where there's no right way to be a Catholic woman. Thank you, and have a good night.
Good night, everybody.